Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. Welcome to my channel. My name is Ogbanje Joseph. We are looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Now, after the Second World War and the destruction of the European multipolar structure, the US emerged the strongest economy in the world. Russia, despite the devastating effect of the Second World War, it stood to be strong after the US military. Okay, now with the severe damage of the economy, of Europe, the West dependent on the United States of America, and after the defeat of Japan, Russia emerged the strongest in the Eastern Bloc, while the US maintained the Western pole. The trend, however, has created an enabling environment for the struggle of superpower vacuum between the US and the Soviet Union. Okay? Now, Cold War was a political and economic struggle between the Western and Eastern blocs, with the former led by the US and the latter by the Soviet Union. That makes the world to be bipolar in nature. What I've just talked about is that between 1945 to 1991, the world was actually divided into, the world was known as a bipolar world. Now, the US actually championed the Western Bloc, and the USSR, that is the Soviet Union, it was Russia that was in charge of the Eastern Bloc. Now, during this period between 1945 to 1991, it was actually referred to as the Cold War. Now, this Cold War, was made up of ideological rivalry, alliances and counter-alliances, arms race, proxy wars, propaganda, economic rivalry, and so on. Now, it was actually a war that was short of physical confrontation between these two power blocks. Now, let us look at the Cuban crisis of 1962, because it happened during the Cold War era. Now, the Cold War was a period of competition and confrontation. It was also a period of military threat, and there was possession of nuclear weapons by both parties. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 saw the Cold War under great danger. Okay, now the crisis was that Khrushchev of the USSR installed an offensive missile in Cuba. Okay, he installed an offensive missile in Cuba. Khrushchev did that in order to avenge, a move made by the US, and because the US had installed some medium-range Jupiter, some medium-range Jupiter missiles in Turkey, an offensive missile, and also an offensive missile in Hungary. The proximity of Hungary and Turkey from Russia was perceived as so close for the US to have put its offensive missiles there. Now, what has happened, during this missile crisis was the world that was actually at the brink of another world war. Because if these missiles had actually been shot by either the US or Russia, the world would have actually gone on its knees again, and the world would have experienced, its third world war. Now, this Cuban Missile Crisis actually happened during the Cold War. I have said that the Cold War was actually a period between 1945 and 1991. it was a war that was actually that was actually prosecuted by two world great leaders, Joseph Stalin and Woodrow Wilson. These great leaders actually championed their countries. For Woodrow Wilson of the US and Joseph Stalin of the USSR, for them, it is actually a fight for superiority. Fight for superiority because, of course, the world at that point actually became bipolar because of ideological rivalry. What was the ideology? Now, the West championed capitalism and the East championed socialism or communism. We also have economic rivalry. Okay, the economic rivalry was that, of course, the Western world actually looked at Marshall Plan as what is going to be able to actually bring the Western world from the economic doldrum that they faced. Now, the Eastern Bloc also had an economic policy called the Molotov Plan. We also have alliances and counter alliances during this period. We also had the arms race because, of course, there was actually missile, the building of missile weapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, were actually built at this period. Okay, so now the rivalry was between these two power blocks. We have the Western world on the one hand, and of course the Eastern bloc on the other hand. Now, even their military rivalry was actually between NATO for the Western world, and Warsaw Pact for the Eastern bloc. So now it is very safe to actually explain that the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 happened during the Cold War. What precipitated that crisis was because of the Cold War that happened at that period. Okay, now if that this crisis actually brought about the world close to another world war, and if that had happened, the world would have actually experienced another war. Okay, this kind of crisis is actually a global crisis and should not be allowed by the United Nations to repeat itself again. Otherwise, it will actually take the world backwards again to the brink of another world war. So thank you very much.